Music, after all, is not a thing, but a verb. It's an act that pierces the veil of the ordinary and sets into play a conversation between our interior experience and our collective experience. So says music educator Tanya Kalmanovich. Music is not a thing, but a verb. So if music is a verb, what does it do? What's its impact? That's the question we will explore in the next 3 days. Kalmanovich gives her answer. It's an act that pierces the veil of the ordinary and sets into play a conversation. But of course, there can and there should be many, many answers to this question. And, you know, it may feel a little abstract and maybe even a little overly self-reflective. I mean, after all, we know the feeling we get from a great musical experience. And we can see and we can feel it among our audiences. The impact is palpable. But the work of orchestras takes place in the ever-changing public sphere, where we enjoy the benefits of a public policy that affords us indispensable economic rewards in exchange for providing public benefit. And what is that public benefit? What is the impact, and how do we describe it? And how do we achieve the greatest impact? The individual pleasure and satisfaction that those of us in this room get from going to concerts and playing concerts does not meet the test of public benefit. The public sphere and its instrument, the nonprofit sector, aspires to broad social good. In the words of John W. Gardner, educator, activist, public servant, and founder of Common Cause and the independent sector, the nonprofit sector enhances our creativity, enlivens our communities, nurtures individual responsibility, stirs life at the grassroots, and reminds us that we were born free. Our answers about impact belong in and around these aspirations, and they must be grounded in our essential nature as performers of orchestral music. Though we're committed to lifelong learning, we're not schools. And while we may partner with civic organizations to strengthen our communities, we're not social service agencies. Authentic impact must begin with a consideration of the orchestral experience itself as a social good. So to help us explore what that means, we've asked a lot of musicians to join us at this year's conference. And in case you haven't noticed, every one of our keynotes is being delivered by musicians. We're also hearing from a lot of composers. We have our Music Alive composers here this week. We have the composers from our Toolman commissioning program. And we're very pleased to welcome the musicians from the Artists Council of our new National Alliance for Audition Support with us during the week, and we'll hear more about them tomorrow. And don't worry if you're not a musician or a composer. We need everybody in this conversation. So, as we start on this journey about how we create the greatest impact, we're going to begin with Vijay Gupta. Now, in reading about Vijay and trying to get prepared for introducing him, I came across an article by Steve Lopez. And some of you may recall, he's the journalist from the LA Times. He was played by Robert Downey Jr. in the film The Soloist. So when Lopez met Vijay, this is from the LA Times, he wrote, "Before going to see him, I looked up his biography, which made me consider throwing myself in front of a moving truck. The New York native graduated from college with a pre-med biology degree at 17. He graduated from Yale with a master's in music at 19. In his spare time, as an aspiring neuroscientist, he did laboratory research at Harvard and 2 other colleges studying Parkinson's, spinal cord regeneration, and the effects of pollution on the brain. I wasn't sure whether I wanted to interview him, clone him, or strangle him." So indeed, Vijay Gupta, violinist, speaker, and passionate advocate for artistic voices at the center of social justice, made his solo debut with the Israel Philharmonic Orchestra under the baton of Zubin Mehta at age 11, and has performed as a recitalist, soloist, and chamber musician on an international scale since the age of 8. In 2007, at the age of 19, he joined the LA Philharmonic. As a 2011 TED Fellow, Gupta founded and began directing Street Symphony, a nonprofit organization dedicated to engaging underserved communities experiencing homelessness and incarceration in Los Angeles through musical performance and dialogue. In 2017, Vijay was nominated and named one of 6 National Citizen Artist Fellows by the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts. He also serves on the faculty of the Longy School of Music at Bard College in the Masters of Arts in Teaching program, which prepares musicians to become agents of change through the study of performance, music pedagogy, and social justice. In 2017, at age 29, he was awarded the Leonard Bernstein Lifetime Achievement. He had a lifetime achievement, he was only 29. For the elevation of music in society, and that's just the first paragraph. I'm not going to read the rest. Anyhow, there could be no person better qualified to get us started on this question of how we create the greatest impact than Vijay Gupta. Please join me in welcoming him to the stage.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is such an incredible honor to be able to speak before you today. Of course, I'd like to give you a little musical offering to kick off this conversation. Across our entire country this month, we are celebrating Pride. But yesterday was the 2-year anniversary of the shooting in Orlando at the Pulse nightclub that claimed the lives of 49 people. This is a little musical offering in their memory, and I ask you to please hold your applause in a moment of silence after I've finished. A couple of years ago, as I was starting the work that would become Street Symphony, I was invited to perform at the Patton State Hospital in San Bernardino. I was invited by a clinical psychologist who informed me that everyone incarcerated at Patton was there because they had committed a serious, often violent crime due to a severe mental illness. I had never engaged an audience like this before in my life, and believing in the universal power of music, I picked the most universal and most powerful piece of music that a violinist could perform, which is the chaconne from the Partita in D minor by Johann Sebastian Bach. If you can tell by my tone that things didn't go well, it's because things did not go well. I started performing for this group of people, and it was one of those rare times where, as a performer, you actually begin to believe that things are going well in the concert. And so I was playing, I was getting towards the end of the chaconne. I felt like, okay, I'm gonna get like a decent round of applause and we'll do some dialogue, I'll play an encore and it'll be great. Instead, when I finished, I got crickets, like nothing. And there's not much worse for the fragile self-esteem of an orchestral musician than to have nothing happen from an audience. And so a gentleman in the middle of the room, he was an inmate and he happened to be African American, he stood up and he said, "Son, after all of that, do you not know any songs we know?" And the first thing that came to my mind was the Titanic theme song. And then immediately how there could not possibly be something worse to play in a state hospital than the Titanic theme song. And so I floundered, I turned red, I was sputtering for words. And in what turns out to be the greatest music lesson of my life, he started to sing to me. And he started to sing a song called Jesus on the Main Line. I had to actually go back and look up the lyrics, and it turns out that this song was actually one of the freedom songs. It was a song that was sung during the civil rights movement. Jesus is on the main line. Call him up and tell him what you want. If you're down and out and want to get out, tell him what you want. If you're sick and you want to get well, tell him what you want. Now, I've had a couple of years to think about that experience and a couple more years to reconsider ever playing the chaconne ever again. But what I hear now in that man's request and in that man's song wasn't, do you know something that will entertain me? But rather, do you see me? Do you know who I am? Do you know my history? Will you reflect who I am while you stand on that stage? I spend most of my mornings and evenings on stage with one of the greatest orchestras in the country. But most afternoons, I'm in a community known as Skid Row. In walking distance of Walt Disney Concert Hall, Skid Row is the epicenter of the crisis of homelessness in America today. LA County is home to over 60,000 people experiencing chronic homelessness. And nestled within the bright lights of downtown Los Angeles, Skid Row is a community of nearly 2,000 people living in tents or simply sleeping on the sidewalk, in and out of clinics and shelters. Folks in Skid Row, usually poor people of color, often find themselves battling some form of mental illness or addiction. As the de facto treatment of mental illness in the United States is incarceration, many people living in Skid Row also face the revolving door of mass incarceration in the largest county jail system on the planet, which also, effectively, is the largest psychiatric institution on the planet. In fact, the drop-off point for people emerging from incarceration in Southern California jails and prisons is a place in Skid Row called the Nickel. It's the intersection of 5th and San Pedro, where the threat of relapse and retribution is possibly more available than opportunities for recovery and redemption. The LA County jails and the Skid Row community are the heart center of the work of Street Symphony. which serves to place social justice at the center of world-class musical engagement. As a community often described as a disgrace, a community defined by generational trauma, Skid Row is also one of the most vibrant and resilient, brave, and artistic communities of people living in America today. As my dear friend, colleague, and Street Symphony's composer-in-residence, Rina Esmail, says, for people living in Skid Row, music is not a form of entertainment, it's a lifeline. The grassroots network of nearly 70 musicians who comprise Street Symphony are my colleagues in the LA Philharmonic and LA Master Chorale, studio and recording musicians, young emerging artists, my students from the Longy School of Music and the Colburn School, and conservatories all over the country, as well as musicians from the jazz, klezmer, Afro-Cuban, reggae, and mariachi traditions, which comprise just some of the vibrant fabric of art in Los Angeles today. For us musicians, this work has become a lifeline as well. This work reminds us why we ever became musicians in the first place, to connect with the world around us, to ask questions, and to tell stories. I get to spend a lot of time stuck in traffic in Los Angeles. Usually I'm on my way to rehearsal or a concert in between meetings with donors and partners and musicians. And in a sense, that's a very real metaphor for the conversations we're about to have. For artists, our job is not housed in any one space, but rather between spaces. Our greatest good and greatest impact is not achieved only on stage at the concert hall or only in the county jail, but rather, as my mentor and hero Liz Lerman puts it, our work is to literally hike the horizontal between these places. It is the artist's job to place her body and her artistry in the void, in the divide between inmate and deputy and policymaker, in the voids created and perpetuated by structural violence and institutional racism, in the void between how we think of ourselves as professional artists and how we live as engaged citizens in the world. As we convene this conversation on achieving the greatest impact, we are surrounded by artists and arts leaders in this room who commit to groundbreaking new ways to show up to the world around them. Musicians like Juan Ramirez Hernandez, Aaron Hannigan, Jody Chafee, John Beck, and Jeffrey Barker are the recipients of the Ford Musician Awards for Excellence in Community Service, whose stories we will hear tomorrow. Orchestras small and large, new and established, ranging from the activist orchestra A Dream Unfinished to the Chicago Symphony Orchestra itself, form diverse ensembles and initiatives which look and sound like their communities, while partnering with advocacy organizations to produce musical programs which reflect the issues and concerns facing our nation today, such as police brutality, gun violence, the school-to-prison pipeline, and the current immigration crisis. The Eugene Symphony creates opportunities for dialogue between musicians, members of their staff, and their board of directors in curating and creating community programs. The Kennedy Center upholds the presence of the arts in democratic participation by activating and championing the voices of citizen artists throughout the country. At Street Symphony, we create a new organizational and artistic structure which is nimble, highly local, and grassroots, with a board, a staff, and artists all in lockstep, with a mission to have a lasting impact on historically and presently oppressed communities. Our greatest impact is determined by the nature of our conversations with our partners, our musicians, and our audiences. As artists and art leaders, we must reclaim the conversations about why we became artists in the first place. This conference is a call to action, a time for us to reframe our conversations away from the double bottom line of fiscal growth and so-called artistic excellence, beyond the endless work of centennial celebrations and endowment campaigns, and to what really matters to our country today: It is as much our job to heal and inspire as it is to disrupt and provoke. This is our time to ask the usually inefficient and always uncomfortable questions about how we will adapt to our entire field rapidly shifting in social and cultural ways. How we are going to adapt to unprecedented human migration and ecological devastation. It's time for us to truly reflect the concerns of a nation grappling with a legacy of toxic patriarchy and atavistic, institutionalized racism. All while being brave enough to grapple with how those same issues fuel the internal workings of our own institutions. Right now, our nation looks to us in order to make meaning for ourselves and the world around us. Our communities look to us to use the music we know and love, to use the artistic process itself to create new restorative cultures for all people, whoever and wherever they are. When we engage in this joyful work, we assume our natural seat at the table as leaders of a vibrant national cultural discourse. We here are charged with creating a pathway from arts engagement to true civic engagement, where we might hold up an honest mirror to American and global society in desperate search of their common humanity. Now, the global search for common humanity was sort of the last thing on my mind when I joined the LA Phil in 2007. I was 19, it was my first audition, and I seriously thought that I had more of a chance of jumping off a chair and landing on the moon than I did winning a job in the LA Phil. But after about 10 years in the orchestra, what continues to take my breath away is that I joined not just a world-class orchestra, but a world-class community of people. There were musicians in that orchestra, musicians like Meredith Snow and John Lofton, who are in this room today, musicians who literally adopted me, invited me into their homes, cooked me meals, opened bottles of wine that I wasn't legally allowed to drink yet. And then, after we were just buzzed enough, we would read string quartets. And what I realize now is that that's how they were teaching me. That's how they were teaching me about how to blend my sound and play with a good articulation and listen to other voices in the texture. However, as I joined the LA Philharmonic, I also became part of another story, the story of a man named Nathaniel Anthony Ayers, who was one of the first black men to study at the Juilliard School in Manhattan in the 1970s. And Nathaniel, in his junior year, was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. He dropped out of Juilliard and he ended up living in the 2nd Street Tunnel in downtown Los Angeles. Now, at one point, Steve Lopez, the LA Times columnist that Jesse alluded to earlier, called a man at the LA Phil named Adam Crane, who has like some small job with a small orchestra on the East Coast somewhere now. Adam Crane is now the vice president of external affairs for the New York Philharmonic. But at the time, he was working PR in Los Angeles, and Steve was asking Adam if Nathaniel could attend a rehearsal at Walt Disney Concert Hall, because when they tried to buy tickets to come to the hall, Nathaniel said no one should have to pay good money to sit next to someone like me in a concert hall. And so many of the musicians in the LA Philharmonic, myself and Adam, we became part of Nathaniel's life. There was one time when Nathaniel invited me to his 57th birthday party, which was actually held on Beethoven's birthday instead of his own birthday, because Nathaniel would rather celebrate Beethoven's birthday than his own birthday, and it was in a bowling alley. And that week at the LA Phil, we were performing a program of Beethoven's 1st and 4th symphonies. And Nathaniel and I started talking. I happened to have my violin with me, and he asked like very pointed, specific questions that only a complete string nerd could ask about how on earth we played that complicated passage work in the last movement of Beethoven's 4th Symphony. So I just pulled out my violin and I showed him how I was practicing. And a couple of months later, I got a call from Steve saying that Nathaniel wanted a violin lesson with me. And it was after one of these lessons that I began to realize that this man had a savant-like knowledge of music. He knew every single Beethoven opus number. He even knew those weird Schubert numbers and Haydn numbers. He was someone who deserved to be on our stage. And this question started to emerge for me, that how was it that this man ended up living in the 2nd Street Tunnel? And there was a time when Adam and I went out for sushi in Little Tokyo after one of our lessons with Nathaniel, and we're driving back across the 2nd Street Tunnel, and we see Nathaniel setting up his milk crates on the side of the tunnel to begin practicing. And we almost crashed the car. I don't know if that's as much about Adam Crane really not being someone who should drive vehicles, or about the fact that what we actually felt was the crash of our own privilege. That we were asking a homeless, mentally ill man to push a shopping cart from Skid Row to Walt Disney Concert Hall because that's where we felt comfortable engaging him. And so from that time, we started to visit Nathaniel in the city. I remember playing in front of the Colburn School, playing at the corner of Hill and 4th, and eventually playing in Skid Row, playing in this courtyard surrounded by rusting metal bars topped with barbed wire. And in this courtyard, our lesson and our music and our conversation mattered as much as it did in the concert hall. And it became very clear to us that this man could have only been homeless not only because he was mentally ill and poor, but absolutely because he was also black. And we started to ask, how many more Nathaniels are out here? How many more artists are in this community who aren't going to have a book and a movie made about them? And so I started to reach out to clinics and shelters in Skid Row. I would take those same LA Philharmonic musicians who would feed me and teach me in their homes, and I wouldn't quite tell them exactly where we were going, but I would tell them that we would have lunch afterwards on me. And so we would go to the Department of Mental Health clinic in Skid Row and play your typical drive-by Beethoven program, where we play like 2 movements of Beethoven and some string quartets, some Christmas carols, and then we're like, we're done with this. And then at the ends of our programs, or even between movements, people in our audience would raise their hands. And we, classical musicians, would go, whoa, 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 I did not sign up for human contact, right? And yet what would happen is that our audiences would ask us questions, the kinds of questions that we had never asked ourselves, the kinds of questions that we don't get to have conversations around with our audiences in our concert halls, the kinds of questions that are almost taboo in conservatory, which is, why do you play music? Who are you? Why should I love the music that you love? Why do you love it? And slowly the conversation began to change because we started to rehearse our programs differently. We started to program less music and have more space for dialogue to talk about what we actually were discussing in rehearsals. We all know that chamber music is that beautiful conversation, and in a sense, Street Symphony became a natural extension of that conversation, where we were able to go into Twin Towers Jail, into a place that is one of the largest psychiatric facilities in the country, as I mentioned earlier. But we would play for men in a mentally ill ward, and we play the music of Schumann. And one of the inmates actually said to us, you know, Schumann died in a place like this. And suddenly our entire understanding of how we played Schumann completely changed. We would actually feel free going into a shelter, a clinic, or a county jail because we knew that our music making wasn't about how perfectly we thought we played, but rather in how beautifully and transparently we connected with our audiences. We're going to cue up a video that I'd like to share with you all. One of the first questions that we asked at Street Symphony was, how many more Nathaniels are out here? And in the course of now nearly 400 events over the last 8 years presented at 5 LA County jails and 3 partners in the Skid Row community, we've met hundreds and hundreds of Nathaniels. And Ben Shirley is just one of them. Let's play the video, please.
Last week we did it at a really slow tempo and I was plotting. It's almost like just a bouncy kind of, just heavy sounding. Music has been my saving grace for my whole life. Near the end of my addiction, it saved me from prison.
Oh, okay. Louis, I think we're ready to take.
I'm at the Cavalry First Baptist Church recording my piece for Shastra School of Indian Music.
This is Ben, Shirley, sections A and B.
I started working with Rena through the Street Symphony when Vijay Gupta asked me to be composer fellow. She's walked me off the ledge, given me encouragement.
She'll have to go through Deka Lubani, and then I'm going to start cueing in the string players after that. All right. That sounded awesome. Okay.
Been given a great opportunity and I want to work hard on this new life. I was the guy that wanted to play rock music, did that. I want to get in a sign band, did that. I'm playing in front of a stadium full of people that knew the songs. Here's your magazine covers, here's all that crap that I thought I wanted, I got it, and I just hated myself even more. I drank 4 bottles of vodka a day. I had a $360 heroin habit a day. I took countless pills and cocaine, and I was an absolute animal. I had some people in recovery pull me out of the house going, we're not gonna walk in one day after you haven't answered the phone and find you dead on the floor. Take me down to Skid Row, drop me off at the Mission. It took me a good 9 days to quit shaking and throwing up, and another 6 months to quit hallucinating. I remember saying it, I'm done, and it felt different. Slowly but surely, baby steps, inches, things got better, and I bought into the recovery. Play it nice and soft like you do, but the rest of the piece kind of make it bitey sounding or aggressive. You're groovy on that. I heard maybe just bump up dynamics.
Ben is such a special person to have as our first composition fellow because he is both a professional musician and a member of the Skid Row community.
In the course of over 300 events in clinics and shelters and county jails, we've met thousands of people who have amazing stories and who deserve a platform to tell that story.
Hey guys, my name is Benjamin Shirley. I'm a composer fellow in the Street Symphony. I was a resident of the Midnight Mission for 26 months. I wrote this piece, bassoon and voice. This is my first performance, and I'm glad it's here.
When we have access to that creative and expressive possibility, we become advocates for ourselves.
And I've got my love for music back, and I've got this wonder and excitement. I absolutely want to keep this thing going and be involved with Street Symphony for as long as it goes.
I want to share a story before our next video, which is about our composer in residence, Rena Esmail. As we started to open up our structure of how we created programs, we started to bring in composers who would actually create pieces of music that were about and composed with the Skid Row community. And there was a time where Rena, who had actually trained as a Western classical composer, but who had won a Fulbright to go to India, composed a string quartet based on Indian ragas. And we took it into Twin Towers Jail to perform for a group of women. And I kind of like watching my colleagues squirm when I throw them into the deep end a little bit. And I actually asked Rena if she would sing each raga, and she had this kind of terror around singing in public. But she thought, what the hell, I'm in a county jail, and she sang. And she sang beautifully, and actually, at the end of our concert, the women in the audience demanded an encore from her, from Rena. And a couple of months later, Rena went into a different county jail in a totally different part of Los Angeles, and a woman in the audience actually said, "Are you gonna sing for us today?" And Rena said, "No, I don't like singing in public." And this lady said, "Bullshit, girl. You sang for us at Towers. You're gonna sing for us today." And so it's just one of these amazing examples of how when we go into communities, our ideas of excellence change. We have to discover new tools and skills to be able to do this work in a way that is truly authentic and equitable. The Messiah was written in 1741, and the first performance was delivered in Dublin with the goal of releasing 142 men from debtor's prison. When the concerts were held in London, they were not held in a concert hall or a cathedral, but rather in the Foundlings Hospital. And in fact, if you look at the marketing materials from the 1740s, because they do exist, of this concert, men are asked to leave their swords at home, and women were asked not to wear hoop skirts because they wanted to pack in as many people into the Foundlings Hospital as possible. A couple of years ago, a few members of the Skid Row community approached us with a desire to present a sing-along of Handel's Messiah in Skid Row. And I'm going to tell a little bit more of that story at the end of this talk in a couple of minutes. But we have another video that we're going to run. And just to preface this video, the video you just saw, as well as the entire live stream of this third Messiah project, was actually shared on the Kennedy Center's Facebook page. One of the things that Rena and I, as citizen artist fellows with the Kennedy Center, developed with the Kennedy Center team was a way to keep our work and our actions very local and intentional, but to share them on a global scale. And I think at this point, over 11,000 people have watched the live stream of this Messiah project. So let's run this video, please. In the center of one of the largest and most creative American cities, we have tens of thousands of people who live in tents. I'm angry that a place like Skid Row exists. People who are talented, resilient, who deserve to have their voices heard, are silenced by structural inequality and systemic racism. And in my mind, the artist's role is to serve as a bridge.
When you hear somebody singing or playing an instrument, it's coming from their soul. It's coming from their heart, and it's reaching out to others.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is my absolute honor to welcome you to this third Messiah project. We are presenting excerpts of Handel's beloved Messiah alongside a series of pieces of music which tell the story of people who experience homelessness and poverty in Los Angeles today. Our goal is to share our stage with the Skid Row community. This is the first year of the launch of the Street Symphony Fellows program. And this year, Ben Shirley is our composer fellow.
Ben is such a special person to have as our first composition fellow because he is both a professional musician and a member of the Skid Row community.
We're going to premiere a brand new piece of Ben's that we have commissioned ourselves called We Need Darkness to See the Stars.
I came down here from drugs and alcohol, and now it's come full circle, and just overwhelming. I've got this wide open, endless music to study and listen to and explore, and it's been my lifesaver. Hopefully, some of the guys at the mission will look and say, if this idiot can do it, I can get my life to be better.
We also have vocalist fellows who are performing this year, Bryan and our mezzo-soprano, Christina Collier.
The people that walk in darkness.
The piece that I'm singing is The People That Walked in Darkness. For me, this piece is like the Phoenix Rising.
The people that...
When I came here 3 years ago, I had a month clean from a heroin addiction. So today I celebrate the resilience of your ever-expanding souls. And I pray that you see the light inside you and give it permission to shine.
And they that dwell in the
Homelessness and drug addiction are just conditions. They're not really who we are.
shadow of death.
This is huge. Like, I've never done anything like this before. I am a Skid Row resident. Never in a million years did I think that I would be singing along with members of the LA Phil and the Master Chorale. The song, He Shall Feed His Flock Like a Shepherd, it makes me feel like I want to take everyone in my arms and just give them a big hug and let them know that, you know, everything's going to be all right.
Today's a new day.
Everyone on Skid Row came from somewhere.
It's not right that there's human beings sleeping on the sidewalks. And I'm going to continue to use my voice to tell people about what's going on.
It's up to us to cause that awareness shift from cynicism and complacency to empathy and community.
If I can just touch one heart today, then mission accomplished.
So that round of applause belongs to the Skid Row community. One of the things that you don't see in this video is all of the workshops, the before and after that happens with any beautiful transformative communal experience. But the musicians of Street Symphony are also in constant dialogue with another organization in Skid Row called the Urban Voices Project, which is Skid Row's community choir. They are currently fiscally sponsored by Street Symphony, and musicians like Bryan and Christina are members of the Urban Voices Project community. After the Messiah Project concert happens, musicians from Street Symphony, members of our orchestra and our chorus, actually go into the Skid Row community and hand out hundreds of hygiene kits. These are little bags that contain soap and toiletries and feminine hygiene products and socks and razors. And in fact, these kits are actually shopped for by the musicians. They do their own crowdfunding campaign for them. They even assemble the kits during the rehearsal for Messiah Project. And then the handing out of the kits is actually the most important part of Messiah Project. There's one last thing I want to point out about this video, and then I'll wrap up this talk, which is to say, at some point during the video, you saw a man standing up and wiping tears from his eyes. So before we began the live stream, we had to sort of make sure that all the technical stuff was working well. So I invited a mostly female mariachi ensemble to open the Messiah Project. And they were playing, you know, songs from Feliz Navidad to Guantanamera. And the moment that the musicians started to play Guantanamera, this man in the back stood up. And he put his fist in the air, and he started to shout every single word of the song. And he was weeping. And then once we began the live stream, our lead violinist, Jazmin Morales, she led the mariachi ensemble towards the back of the room to watch the Messiah Project, and this man basically like accosted Jazmin. And he held on to her and he shook her and he said, "I haven't heard that song in 45 years. I haven't heard that song since I left Cuba. And the only reason why I'm gonna stay and listen to the rest of this gringo music is because you saw me. Is because you saw me." The indigenous Australian artist and activist Lila Watson says, "If you have come here to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together." At Street Symphony, we have only one organizational best practice, and that's to show up. We show up to be in relationship with our neighbors wherever and whoever they are. We have to show up because the Skid Row community matters. Their stories matter, their neighborhoods matter, their lives matter. We show up because they teach us about resilience, about perseverance, and the true meaning of artistry. They are our teachers, our friends, our colleagues, and our community. We show up because our liberation is bound up in theirs. Every person deserves access to a creative and expressive voice, and every person deserves access to the condition in which that voice is heard and received. At Street Symphony, our work now is to move into a place where the Skid Row community is not only in our audience or on our stage, but is on our staff, is on our executive staff, and is on our board of directors, actively curating and engineering their definition of social change through music. We strive to create an organization which looks like the community we serve. Our power lies not only in sharing our stage, but in sharing our entire organization. Our art becomes stronger when we are brave enough to open ourselves up into trust, cooperation, and community. This is a movement of radical mutuality, where the communities of artists and arts leaders housed in our institutions come into honest and particular relationships with the communities who seek to participate and make meaning in our rapidly shifting social and cultural landscape. This is a mutuality which challenges us to throw away old ideas of expertise and best practices and explore a new transformative possibility where our artistry does not lie in presenting the best version of music written in a different culture and a time, but rather how radically we welcome the communities on our margins into the center of the artistic process, using our music, our process, and our space to convene conversations and experiences toward the goal of our common humanity. This is the literal meaning of culture: to tend and cultivate and redefine our humanity with each other. At Street Symphony, we started out wanting to meet more people like Nathaniel Ayers. We are awestruck at the power and resilience of the Skid Row community as we witness the musicians we have met step into their own power and into their own advocacy, taking charge of their lives. We watch and cheer as Ben Shirley becomes a mentor to aspiring composers living in Skid Row. Our vocalist fellows, Christina Collier and Bryan found a way to be supported by the community they helped build themselves. They learned to ask for what they needed in their own lives. Bryan recently reconnected with his daughter and got a license to pour concrete. Christina recently graduated from months of grueling training to become a bank teller. They both still show up to choir rehearsals and lessons, and Bryan, in fact, recently offered to start paying for his own lessons. Sometimes all we can do, to quote Kendrick Lamar, is sit down and be humble and watch the Skid Row community move into the breathtaking advocacy that teaches us how to be citizens. Bryan likes to say that one act of love he knows for sure is listening. Our greatest impact lies in how well we listen and how we show up to the ideas and issues which matter to the Skid Row community. To use a musical metaphor, our job isn't to be the soloist or the maestro, it's to be the accompanist, maybe to be the arranger. Our job is to listen louder than we sing, play, or speak. It's to hold space for the conversations. As we listen to and invest in the ideas of the Skid Row community, the space for that conversation becomes the organization itself. And when we leave Skid Row, our organization becomes a pathway to use our power and our privilege to tell the story of this neighborhood and this community as one of the most vibrant and artistic communities in America today. I'm going to end with one last story, and I tell this story with the permission of the man who it's about. Don Garza was a combat veteran, a Marine who served in Desert Storm, and he was dishonorably discharged, so he is not eligible for any of the benefits that veterans are usually eligible for. On top of that, when Don came home to Dallas-Fort Worth, he was disowned by his family. His family said, "You shot at people who couldn't shoot back, and you're a disgrace." And so Don went on to serve at the naval base in Okinawa, where he tried to commit suicide. And he wasn't given any treatment or care. In fact, he was placed in solitary confinement, which is the worst possible thing to do to someone who has suicidal ideation. The thing that kept Don alive, that he told me through months of conversations as I began to coax out the story of who he was, is that when he was in the brig of this ship, all he could do was sing to himself, because he loved singing the Messiah as a child. And I mentioned earlier that the Messiah Project was actually not our idea, but the idea of the Skid Row community. In large part, it was Don Garza's idea to have a Messiah sing-along happen in Skid Row. Don, similar to Nathaniel, ended up wandering across the United States, came back to LA, lived in a tent in Skid Row for over 10 years, and still lives in SRO housing in Skid Row, where he spent another 10 years. And when we presented our first Messiah Project, I watched as Don Garza sat in the very front row, and he wept as he heard the solos, and then he would jump back into the stage and into the chorus, and he would sing all the choruses from memory. And I watched this dance, and then after that very first Messiah Project, completely unprompted by me, our tenor soloist, a man named Daniel Chaney, started to give voice lessons to Don. And it was a time when Daniel himself was actually diagnosed with terminal cancer. And even as he was dying, Daniel kept giving lessons to Don Garza. And in our second Messiah Project, Don was the tenor soloist. Now, for this man, who is so hyper-vigilant that he cannot close his eyes to go to sleep at night, for him to stand in front of 300 members of his own community and sing the words, "Comfort ye, comfort ye, your warfare is accomplished," that's not only great music, that's the beginning of justice as well. Thank you very much.